Close your eyes and listen, the howl of the wind, the crackle of fire rising from wooden houses, a distant wolf's howl. This is a Viking village from centuries ago, washed by icy winds, nestled at the foot of snowy mountains. But don't be afraid, no one will draw a sword on you here, we will not set sail on longboats through stormy seas. This journey is an escape for you. A break where history is told without war cries, only with the tranquil rhythm of the story, where you can lay down the burden on your shoulders and the enveloping warmth of the voice. Because we know, sometimes the greatest battle is to be able to calm the storms inside us at the end of the day. Now take a deep breath. Set aside those petrified images of Vikings, woven with heroic epics. In their place, listen to the real story of people struggling against the cold, trying to light a fire with half-frozen fingers, striving to hold on to the land and the sea. If you're ready, we are embarking on a journey on the sweet border between consciousness and unconsciousness, on the shore of your dreams rather than the dusty pages of the past. Because tonight, history will be a guide not only to the past but also to your peace. And that story begins on an icy night. Harsh living conditions. When night fell, the wind grew more merciless. The hum seeping through the roofs of the wooden houses played in the ears of the elders like a familiar tune. The wrath of the north was remembered anew each year. Tonight was no different. A small Viking village of 10 households in a different region of the fjords was preparing to sleep under the snow. But here, snow was not a guest that comes in sleep, but one that waits. The cold, leaking from within the night, entered through the gaps under the doors, prowled under the wooden floorboards, touching not the skin but the soul of a person. In one of the village houses, the elderly Astrid was telling stories to her grandson sitting by her knees. She had spoken of the old gods, as was the winter night's custom. Then she told of the great storm that comes just before summer, and finally, she recalled the night years ago when her husband, Bjorn, was lost in a blizzard. Astrid's voice trembled slightly, but there was no fear. The people of these lands had learned to live with fear as they did with the cold. Because in the north, one does not fight nature. One does not stand against it. One lives with it. For the Vikings, life meant constant struggle. But this struggle was not always with wars. Often, it was with nature. Life in the harsh geography of the Scandinavian peninsula was full of difficulties unimaginable to modern humans. The winter months were long and ruthless. On some days, the sun would only appear for a few hours before disappearing again. As the nights grew longer, time slowed down. People, too, sank into their thoughts with this slowness. Sometimes the distinction between night and day blurred, leaving only the cold behind. The houses were simple, plain, and functional. They were structures of natural stone, wooden walls, and thatched roofs. There was a fireplace in the middle. This fire was for both cooking and warmth. But the heat only warmed the immediate vicinity of the fire. In the corners of the house, breaths turned to steam. The wind seeped under the doors, behaving like an invisible guest inside the house. People tried to protect themselves with thick wools, pelts, and layered clothing. But the cold was the kind that passed through the skin and reached the bone. Children would wake up to put wood in the stove, interrupting their sleep. Like Astrid's grandson. While throwing wood with his small hands, he both resisted and shivered. Even in his dreams he had the cold. The land was as merciless as the air. Farming was nearly impossible. The topsoil remained frozen for months. When spring came, planting had to be done quickly. If not harvested in a short time, the crops would either freeze or rot. Preparing for winter started in summer, but no preparation was ever complete. Because the north was never predictable. Supplies were stored, fish were dried, meats were salted. Still, sometimes the food in the pantry would run out, and hunger would come to the door. But hunger did not shout. It waited. Like today's cold. As the nights grew longer, people turned inward. Stories were told. Of the wrath of the gods, wars with giants, the shining halls of Valhalla. These narratives were told not only to entertain children but also to keep adults connected to life. Because darkness sometimes accumulated not only outside but also inside a person. Astrid's story was told so carefully. She especially reminded them of the god Freyr, the god of spring and fertility. If Freyr is forgotten, the winter will be long, she would say. Because sometimes even hope could warm a person. The cold was not fought. One only adapted. The Vikings accepted nature not as an enemy but as a power. They would determine direction by the sound of the wind, predict the weather by the flight of birds. They did not work against nature. They moved with it. This was how they could survive. Their movement, preparation, and thoughts were shaped according to its nature. Her family would have stacked their wood before winter began. Doors were reinforced, clothes were mended. The house was prepared for winter. And yet, when winter came, everyone was a little unknowing. Because no matter how prepared you are, the North has its own rule. It always takes its share. The people of those times were changing. In winter, faces grew pale, eyes became sleepless, but the Vikings got used to it. When spring came, the chimneys of some houses would not smoke. Winter did not let go of its pieces. But those who remained started again. Because living here meant just surviving. Grandchildren learned not to fear the flowers, to grow, and took over the duty of putting wood in the stove. Astrid's house was the definition of this cycle. As the night ended, her little grandson finally dozed off. The flames in the stove flickered. Outside, it was still snowing. But the room preserved stories and memories. Perhaps that was the strongest aspect of the North. Teaching its people to endure by challenging them. The Vikings never became a people who defeated the cold. But they were a people who learned to live with the cold. And that is why they were never forgotten throughout history. The merciless climate of the North both broke and molded them. That's why the Vikings' face had lines washed by snow, silent but deep. The nights were long, the wind strong, the air stingy in these lands. But the Vikings managed to take root amidst all this. Because endurance was not just a record for them, it was a tradition. Sometimes the night began not with cold, but with silence. There was no wind, no snow. It was impossible to see the clouds in the sky. But it was cold. Inside the house, everything was slowly freezing. Not just the body, but thoughts were getting cold. In those ancient Viking villages, where the long nights of Scandinavia became ordinary, staying warm was not a comfort but a way of life. Therefore, their movement was measured, their possessions valuable, their fire sacred. Because when night came, nothing was ordinary. The structure of the houses was shaped by the harshness of that climate. Wooden walls on thick stone foundations, thatched roofs, wide spaces plastered with mud inside. But these efforts could not prevent the wind from seeping in. The cold always found a way. It entered not through the walls but through the silence. In the middle of the houses was a small hearth. Soup was boiled over it, wood was embered beneath it. But it only offered warmth suitable for the vicinity of the fire. By the time it reached the corners of the house, even breath would become steam, clinging to the walls like dew. Therefore, the Vikings did not rely solely on fire to stay warm. They planned their bodies, their clothes, the arrangement of their houses for this purpose. Woolen undershirts, felt trousers, blankets surrounded by animal pelts. Layering was not a skill, it was a tradition. Especially the last layer of pelt worn before sleep at night. It was not the properties of the pelt but the feeling of security coming from within it that brought sleep. Because what a person spent was not only heat but also taken from the familiar order. His clothing, his layer, had a meaning, a past. A cloak inherited from a grandfather, a glove sewn by a mother. These were not just items, they were the journey of the survivors. Sleeping was a preparation in itself. Floor beds were usually laid in the corner of the house closest to the stove. Straw was spread underneath, wool mattresses were placed on top. Family members often slept close together, in close proximity. Warmth was preserved not only by heat but by heat passing from body to body. Children were in the middle, the elderly at the corners. Everyone's place was certain. This order created a collective resistance against the night's cold. Examples were also taken from some houses. Keeping large animals inside was also a way to warm up with their body heat. Animals were valuable not only for hunting but also for warmth at night. Even a dog's breath could be enough to resist a morning on the verge of freezing. Therefore, the Vikings saw animals as companions. The cold was the same for everyone, not just for humans. In the late hours of the night, the fire must not go out. This task was usually given to the youngest in the house. Staying awake or waking up intermittently, checking the wood, stoking the embers, rekindling if necessary. This silent task was not applauded by anyone, but it was vital. Because if the fire went out, everyone's sleep would get cold, and making it to morning became difficult. Fire was not just heat, it was hope. Like a small sign of life winking inside a source of light. Coping with the cold was not just a physical but a mental preparation. People prayed at night. They asked the god Freyr for bounty, Thor to protect their homes. Praying was both filling the silence and calming the mind. Sometimes a prayer became a word of hope. Sometimes it turned into a story told in a whisper. These stories were not to put children to sleep, but to talk to the darkness. Because sometimes a person was afraid not of the cold, but of the silence. The ritual continued through the night in Astrid's house. Her grandson had woken up towards morning, throwing a few small branches into the stove with sleepy eyes. His eyes were half closed. The flames dancing inside the stove illuminated the inside of his eyelids. Then he curled up in his blanket, shivering. Astrid tried to warm the child's hair with her breath, while humming a comprehensive song. That song was not a lullaby passed down through generations, it was the silent prayer of making it to dawn. Staying warm on icy nights was not limited to the struggle inside the house. Those outside also needed it. Those returning from the hunt, those walking along the frozen rivers. Therefore, small lamps were placed by the doors, kept burning all night so that anyone finding their way could see it. The Vikings, despite the harsh conditions, knew how to look out for one another. Because the cold treated everyone equally. The nights were long, the hours heavy, but morning would break somehow. And when morning came, while the last vapor droplet from the stove was still rising towards the ceiling, people would start living again. The warmth never fully arrived, but the weeks slowly covered the person. Hands were still cold, breath still steamed, but the soul got a little more accustomed each morning. For the Vikings, warmth was not a fire but a behavior. A form of existence achieved through resistance, patience, and living together. Perhaps that's why they could never call the warmth they lived in hot, but they continued kept warm enough. Because survival here was not only physical but also a spiritual resistance, and this resistance began anew each morning with a handful of embers. Sometimes, no matter how much effort was put into warmth, it did not pay off. The sun stayed behind the clouds. The rain either never came or suddenly poured down, falling furiously upon the seeds. In these lands, farming was not done with nature but with the mercy of nature, and nature was not always generous to the Vikings. In the north, where the summers were short, the period crops could take was only a few months. The mood of the sky during those months determined the fate of the coming year. A hope starting on a summer morning in the field could be extinguished by a few weeks of drought. All crops could be laid flat in one stormy night. An early frost could destroy everything that had sprouted. When the harvest was weak, a silence would fall over the village. No one said it out loud, but everyone knew. The winter would be hard. Famine was the oldest acquaintance of these people. It was unknown when it would come, but it was certain that it would visit one day. The whispers in the houses increased, the pantry was counted, the smoked fish, salted meats were checked again and again. Each piece of food became more valuable, each morsel was stored more carefully. Hunger did not come immediately. First, the daily portion shrank. The brighter pieces were given to the children. The elderly voluntarily ate less. Milk animals were not slaughtered. Because milk was a more long-term nourishment than meat. More water, less solid food was put into the soup. Stale breads were grated and kneaded again. Leftover bones were boiled. Sometimes only fish broth was consumed for days. If fish could be found. In some families, they started collecting wild plants, mushrooms, even tree bark from the forest. Wisdom raced with hunger. The knowledge of which leaf to collect when, how to boil it to avoid harm, these were silent recipes passed down from generation to generation, from year to year. While nature starved them on one hand, it offered survival routes on the other. provided that your eyes were open, your hands careful, your mind calm. The animals in the pens began to decrease one by one. First the chickens, then the goats. The large livestock were left for last, because they were not only meat but also companions in the field. It meant risking not only one winter but also the next summer. Therefore, many families sat at the table with memories instead of meat. People were quieter, movements slower, conversations less cheerful. Some winters were so difficult that help was sent from neighboring villages. But usually, everyone was in the same situation, because famine was a guest that visited not just one house but all the settlements. Bartering came to the fore again. A bag of barley was sent for, a piece of jewelry was taken out and exchanged. Everything turned into a survival strategy. In those times, the most valuable currency was a full stomach. Hunger consumed not only the body but also the mind. People could not dream, could not plan for the future. They lived only with the idea of making it to the morning. The nights were longer, sleep was lighter. When the stomach was empty, the soul also felt closer to the ground. Some prayed, some remained silent. But everyone wished for the same thing inwardly: for spring to come soon. Spring meant not only green leaves. It was the restart of hope, the possibility of being full. The greatest test of famine was given to the children, because they did not yet know how to be patient. They did not understand how valuable a full stomach was. Mothers tried to make the plates look fuller by decorating them, dividing a morsel while telling a tale. Hunger was understood not from their words but from their eyes, and these eyes showed the real knowledge of Viking society. The difficulty was not only physical. The resilience of the soul was more valuable than physical endurance. When spring finally came, the first green sprout was not only in the soil but also inside people. The first bread, the first warm soup. These were not celebrated like a victory, but there was a quiet joy in every house. As the pantry began to fill again, the things written in winter were slowly replaced. But that famine left a mark. People did not forget it. Preparations for the next winter started earlier, because the Vikings knew hunger does not forget. It can knock on the door. Viking houses and children's world. The houses where the Vikings lived were structures shaped by that harsh geography, sharp winds, and long winters. These houses looked ordinary from the outside, even a bit gloomy. Low roofs, windowless walls, dark stone foundations, and bodies built of thick wooden logs. But in reality, each resembled a silent fortress designed for survival. Because the cold of the north was not only outside, it was also inside, and those houses were the only protection between the Vikings and the world. A Viking house was often rectangular. These structures, called longhouses, could sometimes reach lengths of 10, sometimes 30 meters. Their foundations were reinforced with stones, but the main material was wood. Thick logs cut from the surrounding forests were stacked on top of each other. A mixture of mud and straw was spread between them to try to prevent the wind from seeping in. The roof was sloped, both so the snow would slide off and so the smoke inside could rise. Viking house roofs were usually covered with reeds or grass. This provided both natural insulation and created a naturally harmonious image. Plants grew on the roofs of some houses, birds nested. This silent, slowly growing form of life actually showed that the house lived in harmony with nature. But life in the house was not always this calm. Right in the middle of the houses, there was usually a hearth set into the ground. This fireplace was the heart of the entire house. Both food was cooked here and warmth was provided here. There were no chimneys. The smoke exited through openings in the roof. These openings also provided light. During the day, a dim, dusty light fell into the house through that opening. It gave a faint silhouette to the dark corners. It created trembling shadows on the walls. The shadows sometimes merged with the sound of the fire, making the inside of the house stir as if it were a living being. If there is sun, there is no north wind. And this saying would become a compass for him years later, determining which direction to steer the ship. Being a child in this society was not just a step towards growing up, it was preparation for a global arena where they would have to endure. because the Vikings stood their ground not only with their swords but with the resilience they instilled in their children. The days were quiet, the nights were dark. In those long, dark valleys, threats sometimes came with the howl of the wind, and sometimes they arrived at the door without a sound. Intertribal rivalry, scarce resources, and a code of honor that did not permit insult meant that Vikings had to live in a state of constant vigilance. Conflicts that erupted within the many cells of society were the cause of the greatest pressures. Even if a village had established its own internal order, this order could shatter immediately in a conflict with another village. Land distribution, border violations, grazing areas for animals. Arguments starting over these could erupt overnight after days of tense silence. Raids were often carried out at night, because the night hid real footsteps with the sound of the wind, and the darkness concealed where anyone was coming from. Suddenly, shouts would rise in the village. Animals would flee, screaming. A house would start to burn. The Vikings were always prepared for these raids. But this preparedness did not mean peace. In a corner of the house, there would be a spear. Shields usually stood by the entrance door. Swords were never put away. Even children knew where to hide in an emergency. Women would place a bar against the door and kept water ready not to stoke the fire, but to douse it. Because the fire inside the house was also a target. An enemy seeing the smoke would immediately know where life was. These attacks were sometimes bloody, sometimes swift. Sometimes just a few sheep were stolen and taken away. Other times, a house was razed to the ground. But a raid left not only a material but also a spiritual mark. After an attack, a period of silence would ensue. People wouldn't speak, they would become invisible. Because for a few days, the pain demanded silence. A lost father, a burned barn, or an abducted child. These wounds did not heal easily, and in the Viking world, revenge was not just a right, but a duty. Therefore, one raid would be followed by another. This cyclical tension between tribes also shaped the Vikings' mental world. Nothing was permanent. If there was peace today, it could be broken tomorrow. Therefore, everything was thought of with a backup. Extra salt in the cellar, a horse ready to flee in the stable, food sacks hidden in the attic. These were not just precautions, they had become a reflex. Because to live was to be prepared, and a village caught unprepared might never recover again. Raids created not only physical but also a spiritual exhaustion. Being constantly on alert, flinching at the sound of the door, noticing the direction of the wind, sensing something approaching by looking at the sky. This was the normal state for a Viking. Adults taught the young not only how to shoot arrows but also how to interpret the silences of the night. Because survival sometimes depended not on throwing a spear, but on not making a sound. And amidst all this, people continued to live. Towards morning, a tired father would check on his children. Is the door secure? Is the fire out? Where is everyone? These small checks were, in fact, a great act of taking responsibility for life itself. Because for the Vikings, home was not just a shelter, it was a protected space, and this space had to be defended anew every night. It was easier to know the enemy's strength than to know when he would strike. Uncertainty fractured sleep, but sleeplessness was a price this people was accustomed to. This tension between tribes did not only bring destruction. It also created a vitality, a state of readiness. People became sharper, their attention increased, their sense of unity strengthened. Perhaps this is why the Viking spirit could remain so resilient. Their hardships made them even stronger and united their communities a little more. Because the threat from outside strengthened the bonds inside. In the end, the Vikings lived with war not only on the seas but also within their own villages. But this state of war did not frighten them. On the contrary, it shaped them. Constant danger was not a threat for them, but a reality. And this reality was the most distinct part of the Viking soul. The warrior's daily life. Waking before sunrise was a Viking warrior's habit. Sleep was short, the night cold, the morning silent. While everyone was still asleep, he would stand outside the house, fill his lungs, and breathe in. If the soil was heavy after rain, it wasn't a good time for hunting. If the wind blew hard, archery practice became difficult. But no weather condition disrupted a warrior's preparation. Because preparation in the Viking world was not just a routine, it was existence itself. The first task in the morning was to check his weapons. Sword, spear, shield, each one was inspected by hand. Was the hilt firm? Was the edge dulled? Because a warrior's weapon was not just a tool of defense, it was his honor. A rusty sword showed the carelessness of a scattered mind. A Viking warrior, however, was always ready. No one knew when battle would come. Perhaps in an hour, perhaps within a week. But when it came, no one had the right to say, "I wasn't expecting it." The later hours of the day were usually spent training. Young warriors, under the supervision of elders, threw spears, defended with shields, and sometimes sparred with wooden swords. This training was harsh but real. Because the Vikings knew war was not a game. A mistake in a real situation meant the end. Therefore, every movement was repeated countless times. A person learned not only how to raise the sword, but also when not to raise it. Patience was the greatest strength, and sometimes showing restraint was more valuable than using the sword. A Viking warrior had to be strong not only physically but also mentally. Therefore, evenings were as important as listening to the stories of the village elders. These stories did not only tell of historical heroics. They also whispered about strategy, honor, betrayal, and loyalty. An elder's story was the lived version of a decision to be made in the future. To listen was to think, and a warrior should not swing his sword without thinking. During the day, practical work was also done. Warriors were not only involved in fighting but also in shipbuilding, hunting, and blacksmithing. Because the pieces in the Viking world were interconnected. A warrior had to know how to repair his own armor, had to make his own axe. Someone boarding a ship did not just row, they read the wind, found direction by looking at the stars. When necessary, they cast nets, caught fish, lit fires, boiled water. Life, like war, was multifaceted for him. When evening came, they would gather around the warmth of the campfire. The fatigue of the day was shared around those silent flames. Sometimes with cheer, sometimes in silence, but always with a sense of unity. Tired shoulders turned towards the fire, eyes looked into the darkness, or a hand skillfully touched the hilt of a weapon. Because the night was as full of threat as the day. A Viking fighter had to know how to fight by day and be ready even while resting at night. When sleep came, it had to be deep, but it was short. Dreams were often silenced. Because a warrior's mind calculated even in sleep. Which wind would blow in the morning? Which path was safer? Which flank was vulnerable to attack? Sometimes, even in his sleep, he would hear the sound of an enemy. But it was unclear if this sound was real. It was just his mind's way of staying alert. Because for Viking warriors, peace was a state of war, and life was a march as sharp as a sword and as long as patience. Revenge and feuds. For the Vikings, justice was not always provided by written rules. There was the honor of the community as a whole, and when a shadow fell upon that honor, what came with the shadow was not just grievance, but a person. Revenge. Because living in those lands was not just about survival, but about remaining righteous. And the path to remaining righteous was often a harsh response, following a silent wait. A dispute between tribes, or between two families in the same village, could easily turn into a blood feud. The theft of an animal, a misunderstood word, a slight to one's honor was enough to start the chain. First, a change in glances occurred. Then greetings ceased. Then the silent wait began. Everyone knew how fragile the balance was, but no one took the first step. Because the first step was the beginning of the end. Revenge in Viking society was not a right, but sometimes a duty. When a member of a family was killed, the survivors did not just carry the grief. They were obliged to retaliate, to repay it. Preparations were made in silence. Swords were sharpened, horses were fed. Which path to take at night was known without being spoken. This silence was the oldest language of pain. Because the Vikings expressed pain not by shouting, but by consolidating it. But revenge was never taken in haste. Because a mistake could destroy not only the opposing side but one's own family as well. Therefore, some revenges were postponed for years. A child would grow up, become a man, and set out to avenge his brothers. This was seen as a kind of ceremony. The honor of the lineage was tied to the individual's patience and strength, and this patience sometimes lasted a lifetime. Blood feuds did not remain only between two people. Families, villages, sometimes entire tribes were drawn into this spiral. Every attack brought a new response, and every response brought a new wound. This chain would lengthen, continuing with nothing but blood, the original cause forgotten by all. Therefore, some Viking communities tried to break this cycle with a practice called wergild, a payment of compensation. Peace was attempted by providing goods, animals, or silver for a killed person. But the family might not accept it, because some wounds could not be closed with gold. Women were both silent carriers and secret instigators in this process. Sometimes a sentence whispered by a mother into her child's ear, sometimes the reproach in a wife's eyes would ignite the flame of revenge. And sometimes, women represented a resilience greater than revenge, forgiveness. But forgiveness was a courageous choice in this society. Because the one who forgave did not just pardon someone else, they confronted their own honor. The shadow of revenge was long. It was enough to break sleep, to envelop the nights. Many Vikings found no peace without facing their enemy. Therefore, wars were fought not only outside but also inside. There was an internal struggle, oscillating between conscience and tradition, between patience and anger. And sometimes the real war was fought not with the external enemy, but with the center of one's own being. But the peace that came with revenge was often short-lived. Because every drop of blood spilled created a new debt. The Vikings knew this. That's why some wanted to hold back to protect their own lineage, to agree to a new beginning. But the past did not easily fall silent. The soil where blood was spilled did not know how to forget. Revenge and blood feuds were the branches of a tree growing in the shadow of the Vikings. Each branch carried a different story, each leaf a different face, and the roots of this tree were tied not to the soil, but to memory. Therefore, in those lands, people walked with respect not only for their enemies but also for their own memories. Honor and exile. In the Viking world, honor was carried like a name. A person, upon birth, did not just receive a name. They also shouldered their family's reputation, the deeds done in the past, and what was expected to be done in the future. Honor was an invisible armor. It sometimes protected, sometimes weighed heavily, but it could never be taken off. Because for the Vikings, a life without honor was no different from a dead body. There were rules in society that everyone knew, accepted, but were not written down. If a man broke his word, cheated in trade, or abandoned his comrade on the battlefield, this was not just a small mistake, it left an indelible stain. And this stain would taint not only himself but his lineage as well. Therefore, his behavior, his decisions were taken by thinking not only of today but of the future. When someone's name was mentioned, what mark they left behind was more important than any gravestone. Honor was not a responsibility belonging only to men. Viking women were also bearers of this symbol. Protecting the family, raising the children, ensuring the integrity of the home was an honorable duty. Some women would even don armor and stand alone to protect a household. For them, reputation was a sustained resistance. Being strong was equivalent not to shouting, but to not giving up. Sometimes a warrior's life would end for the sake of his honor. The fear of death paled in comparison to the fear of dishonor. Because to go to Valhalla, the warrior's paradise, a brave death was required. Someone who fled cowardly or abandoned his friend mid-fight would not be remembered even when he died. Whereas someone who stood tall, even if they did not strike the final blow against the enemy, would be told for generations. Death for the Vikings was not an end, but the seal of a life lived rightly. Honor was also about balance. If a person could be patient when angered, respond to an injustice done to them at the right time, and maintain continuity between word and action, respect was shown to that person. Having wealth or power was not enough. What mattered was how that power was carried. Because the Vikings believed that power was temporary, but honor was permanent. At great celebrations, upon returning from expeditions, or at funerals, What people talked about most was not the number of heroic deeds, but how they were accomplished. No matter how well a sword was used, the intention behind it shaped the outcome. Defeating the enemy without unnecessary slaughter, gaining without oppressing the weak. These were what created true reputation. Throughout life, everyone's goal was clear: to leave behind a name that would be remembered with respect. For the child to carry his father's name with pride. For the wife to remember her husband with her head held high. For the neighbors to say, "He is gone, but he left his honor here." All effort was for this. Material inheritances would be temporary. But a name would remain between eras, like snow. It would eventually melt, but it would leave a mark. A Viking, upon waking in the morning, would think not only of what he would do or where he would go, but also of how he wanted to be remembered. Because in that geography, life was short, conditions were harsh, trials were many. But someone who lived with honor, whether a warrior or a farmer, always stood in the same place in the eyes of the community. Respect was earned not only with the sword but with behavior. Therefore, the Vikings lived for honor and lost their lives for its sake. To fear death was to give up reputation, and they knew it. Life was transient. But a good name, if not eternal, would be remembered for a long time. If there was a wind whispering his name over the cold lands, a Viking had truly lived. Outlawry Tleg. For the Vikings, death was not always the most feared thing. Because falling on the battlefield meant earning a place beside the gods. But there was one punishment heavier than death: being cast out from the entire community. Known as Tleg, outlawry, this punishment meant not only being expelled from one's village but also from humanity itself. His name would no longer be spoken, no greetings given, his house would be avoided, glances would slide over him. Being alone was colder than the harsh northern climate. Being ostracized by society was always the result of a crime. But the weight of this crime was as effective as the conscience of the community. Unjust gain, murder, bringing lasting stain upon honor, or plunging a family into shame were sufficient reasons for someone to be declared an outlaw. This decision was usually given at the popular assembly called the Ing. Based on a crowd system, evidence was heard, people spoke, and finally, the community decided together whether the person could continue to live among them. And if the decision was negative, what was given was not a prison sentence, but a sentence of silence. An endless and painful loneliness. The punished person could no longer return home, embrace his family, or even use his own name. Anyone who mentioned him, gave him food, or hid him would be punished in the same way. Therefore, ostracizing someone was to erase them while they were still alive. No friend would remain by his side, nor enemy. The mountains, forests, and stony paths would now be his only companions. Some, faced with this punishment, would take refuge in the mountains, live by hunting, and try to survive. But living alone in Viking geography was almost impossible. Loneliness was more challenging than a full stomach. Because in that life, survival required not just shelter, but community. Being alone as winter approached meant a person's gradual extinction. For someone cast out from society, the greatest punishment was not physical, but spiritual. He could no longer share his story with anyone, sit around anyone's fire. His name would not be mentioned at a table. These people sometimes lived on, sometimes could not manage to survive. But some of them returned years later and either paid a great penance, or dedicated their lives to being accepted again. Because in Viking society, honor was both awarded and could not be easily regained. But sometimes, years of loneliness could soften a heart, could allow a story to be rewritten. This punishment existed as a silent fear within everyone. Because for the Vikings, family, village, community were the most important assets after survival itself. If this bond broke, the person would also disintegrate. Therefore, their actions were carried out carefully, and decisions were considered with an eye on the individual. Being alone was like being left without fire in the midst of the wind. It could be managed for a while, but eventually it froze the person's essence. Being ostracized by society was not a form of exile, it was the forgetting of a soul. And for the Vikings, being forgotten was heavier than death. because a name not remembered was considered to have never lived. Therefore, a Viking strove not only to live bravely but to mature together, to stand together, to be remembered together. And that's why everyone knew deep down, to be outside the community was not just to be distant, but to be comprehensively erased. The sea and navigation, nature and travel were intertwined. For the Vikings, the sea was not just a road. It was also a test. An expedition was not just about going from one place to another. It was about facing the dark face of nature once again. Setting sail required courage, but beyond courage, acceptance. Because the wind could turn, the sky could close, the waters could rise instantly and rage enough to swallow the ship. And the Vikings set sail knowing this directly. In each stroke of the oar, they fought the sea, but never as an enemy, with respect. Because the ocean would either carry them or swallow them. There was no clear line between the two. Ships were the heart of the Vikings. Longships, drakers, with their dragon-headed forms, were designed not only to instill fear but to become one with the sea. They were light but sturdy. They were built on that fine line between gliding over waves and being plunged into a storm. There were rowers on the ship. Rowing was not just a matter of strength, but of rhythm. Each stroke had to follow the other. One's breath had to harmonize with the one in front. This synchronization carried not only speed but also unity. Journeys sometimes lasted weeks, sometimes months. The route was not always clear. There was no compass. They relied on the sun, the stars, birds, and the smell of the water. Experience was more valuable than any map. A Viking captain could sense an approaching storm by the color of the sky, or guess how far the shore was by the flight of a seagull. This intuition was not just knowledge, it was the result of a long-standing relationship with life itself. They had learned to listen to the sea, but it did not always answer. Life at sea was not as stable as on land. Space was limited, the air cold, food scarce. Fish were caught, salted meats stored, water consumed drop by drop. Each day passed with the same faces, the same movements. They slept in the open. The sky replaced the blanket. But it, too, was often covered with clouds. They slept lightly. Because at a moment's notice, when the ship was about to capsize, everyone had to be able to stand. When storms began, not only the ship but the internal balance was tested. Seasickness was the fate of many Vikings. Stomach strength, dizziness, headache. But no one complained. Because at sea, resilience was shown, not complaint. Someone showing weakness endangered not only their own survival, but the entire ship. Therefore, most Vikings carried their pain inside, vomited, but did not let go of the oar. Struggling in silence was more valuable than leaking out loudly. And that silence would resonate within a person, becoming one with them. Sometimes ships were caught in storms and drifted for days without direction. The horizon changed, night and day became indistinguishable. Rain did not wash the face, it stung the skin. Waves passed over people's knees, filling the ship with water. In these moments, everyone's eyes turned to the captain. Because the captain gave not only direction but also hope. With a single glance, he could say, "We can continue," and that word would become stronger than the wave. Sometimes, Vikings returning from an expedition returned from the sea not only with salty winds but with silence. Because not everything experienced there could be told. The sea carried not only water but also memory, and some memories settled not in the tongue but in the depth of the eyes. That's why those who returned did not speak. They just sat opposite the fire, warming their hands and remaining silent. What they had lived through was understood in the silence. For the Vikings, struggling with the sea was not just a physical struggle, it was the training of the soul. Patience, harmony, resilience, and acceptance. These were learned together with the waves. And most importantly, nothing was guaranteed. Their journeys meant either returning home or merging with eternity. Therefore, when a Viking set sail, he whispered a farewell within. As if saying, "I may not return, but I take my honor with me as I go." The wind and silence. The north wind did not just blow, it whispered, carried, concealed. It sometimes touched as if showing a direction. Other times it filled with a hum loud enough to make one forget everything, drowning out sounds. For the Vikings, the wind was not just a natural phenomenon, it was a test. Whether setting out for trade, war, or exploration, the Vikings set sail as if making a pact with nature. The journey was a long meditation. The difference between morning and noon, evening and night would blur. The rhythm of the wind's sound would change. Nothing was heard but the sound of nature. The voices of friends faded away. When alone, only the inner voice was heard. Ah, silence. It was the moment when a person confronted themselves. Some would dissolve in the fog. Fog was the North's most silent and most deceptive curtain. Like an invisible wall, it covered everything, making one lose their sense of direction. Sometimes even a hand stretched out would disappear as if the fingers had vanished. Fog tested the Vikings' patience and calm. To panic meant to take the wrong path. Therefore, a lost Viking had to learn to stop more than to walk. The wind played the same game not only in the forest but also at sea. It would suddenly change direction, fill the sail, divert the ship. For a captain without a compass, the only guide was the sky. But the north winds often came with clouds. Neither sun nor stars were visible. In those moments, captains worked with their intuition, deciding by reading the color of the sea, the flight of birds, the layers of the waves. But still, some expeditions would veer off course, drifting to other shores. And this drifting would sometimes lead to new lands, sometimes turn into the silent beginning of oblivion. Getting lost in the north winds was more than a physical distance. It was an internal disintegration. A Viking left alone would come to know fear, learn patience, and grasp the necessity of moving not against nature, but with it. These disappearances were sometimes journeys of no return, sometimes the purest form of survival. Because the issue was not just where your feet were, but where your heart was. Some Vikings would return days after getting lost. Covered in mud, exhausted, but with a kind of silence diminished in their eyes. It showed that what was experienced in those moments of disconnection was too deep to be told. Others never returned. Their name would be whispered in the prayers of their families, remembered around a fire. Because to be lost was sometimes not to be forgotten, but to be transformed elsewhere. The Vikings therefore greeted the wind with both severity and caution. The wind gave direction, gave a path. It sometimes protected, but other times pulled a person inward. Their journeys were a sum of possibilities. Both being lost and existing were within these possibilities, and the Vikings endured this. With stones under their feet, a silent wind over their heads, and a will hidden and working within them. New lands and settlement. For the Vikings, a new land was not just a spot on a map. It was also the door to the unknown, a beginning where hope and fear walked side by side. Small groups setting out from crowded villages in Norway, Denmark, or Sweden, sometimes caught in a storm, sometimes desperately reaching a shore, would find the landscape spread before them a matter of fate. Can we stay here? New lands were often deserted and silent. But the Vikings knew that silence did not mean safety. Behind it could be hidden enemies, wild animals, unknown diseases, or simply nature's silent resistance. Therefore, the first steps on the new land were taken carefully. Was the water drinkable? Was the soil suitable for farming? Which way was the wind blowing? The answers to these questions determined not only survival but also whether they could stay permanently. Because the Vikings did not look at the place they came to as temporary. For them, the new land held the possibility of building a home. Trees were cut, stones were stacked, the first shelters were built. The houses were constructed as they knew how. But the materials were always different. The wood found in Norway was not in Iceland. In Greenland, there was more stone but less soil. In every place, nature reminded them of its own rules. The Vikings did not fight these rules, they tried to solve them. A waterproof roof, a wall cutting the wind, structures built low to the ground. It was a form of resistance born of experience. If they were to farm, the soil was tested. Some crops wouldn't yield. Then they would turn to fishing. Fish were stored, dried, salted. Animals were often brought along, but surviving in new lands was difficult for them. Some would adapt, some would perish after the first winter. But the Vikings were accustomed to it. They knew how to start over with loss, to begin again. If the community was small, security was the biggest concern. Night watches were kept, incoming sounds were listened for. When other communities were noticed nearby, either peace was sought or conflict began. The Vikings were not in favor of war all the time. Sometimes sharing a bowl of milk could be as valuable as a treaty. But the perception of threat was never absent. Because in a new place, a moment of weakness could lose everything. When winter came, the real test began. The winters of new lands could be different from known winters. How much wood had been stored? How many animals remained? What were the water sources? These questions gained importance not day by day, but hour by hour. Some winters would be months of sustained darkness. On days when the sun didn't rise, not only fire but also stories would provide warmth. Because fire was necessary for the body, stories for the soul. And those stories usually began with the tales of those who had first set foot elsewhere, long ago. Children born in new lands, those who married the local people, Vikings who maintained their own traditions but were shaped according to the wind they contained. Each was a result of this effort. Survival was not just about breathing. Adapting, putting down roots, not being forgotten. That was the real issue. This is how the lands the Vikings went to also became their transformation. Sometimes the place they came to would accept them. Other times, it would reject them. But the Vikings were magnificent in both situations. Because they left a mark everywhere. A rune carved in stone, the remains of a sunken ship, an Old Norse name given to a cape. Everything reminded of this struggle. Trying to exist in the midst of the unknown. Surviving in new lands was possible not only with strength but with patience and intelligence. The Vikings knew this very well, and with this knowledge, they left their mark on the coast, the island, the steppe. Maybe we can hold on here. Maybe we can build a home here. Maybe this will be our new beginning. Life on the longship. Viking ships were strong but narrow, sturdy but uncomfortable. An expedition meant a long journey. A door opening to the unknown, and sometimes weeks of struggle with waves. Life on the ship was a rhythm shaped by patience. Built on wood and knowledge, these ships, having constantly absorbed sea salt, when they set sail, left everyone with the same wish, for endurance. Because these ships were not homes, but they had to be so for a while. The rowers sat shoulder to shoulder. Each one determined his rhythm according to the breath of the next. The sound of oars hitting the water echoed throughout the ship. This sound was sometimes encouraging. Sometimes like a painful repetition. Rowing for hours was a task that tired not only the arms but also the patience. And often this effort was made without knowing exactly where you were going. Because the route was created by the sky together with the captain. The language of the clouds, the directions of the wind, and the shape of the waves. There was no map. Only intuition. When rain started, there was no roof to take shelter under. It wasn't always possible to even gather the sail's fabric. It made clothes heavy, breathing rapid. But the Vikings had accepted this situation. Getting wet was part of the journey. Clothes were not dried because there was no fire to dry them. They tried to start with the body's own heat. That's why they dressed in layers, chose woolen clothes. Wool, even when wet, retained some warmth. But no matter how prepared one was, putting on that damp clothes in the early morning hours required courage. Sleeping was perhaps the hardest thing on the ship. There was no space. There was no wall to lean against, no pillow to rest his head. Only a wooden bench and another person sleeping beside him. As the waves rose, bodies would brace. As the wind picked up, eyes would open. Sleep was short, dreams fragmented. He had to remain alert. The ship could take on water, be found by a storm, or face an attack. Therefore, the Vikings slept with one eye open, and often, as day turned to night, they would memorize the position of a distant star. Perhaps the morning would reveal their situation. Waiting was the longest-lasting part of the sea voyage. Waiting for the wind to shift, the storm to abate, land to appear. Sometimes things changed, sometimes nothing changed for days. The horizon remained fixed, the waves made the same sound. This waiting amplified a person's inner voice. Conversation ceased, everyone turned inward. It was for this reason that some Vikings, at sea, did not just journey, they also encountered themselves. Thoughts they had never heard before would surface in their minds, coming in waves, like a small piece of shore washing up. But there were also moments of sharing within this difficult life. Small stories, quiet laughter, sharing a piece of dried fish. These built warm bridges amidst the cold and wind. The captain's calm gaze, a hand touching a rower's shoulder, a prayer uttered before a storm. These things made life on the ship not just bearable, but meaningful. Because a boat floated not only on the water but also on the will of its people. And when land finally appeared on the horizon, no one shouted. A silent, deep breath was taken, eyes scanned the surroundings. Everyone prepared to disembark from that journey as someone else. Because the days spent at sea took a piece of a person and replaced it with another. The Vikings knew this. When setting sail, they entrusted not just their hands, but their hearts, to the ship. Faith and the spiritual world. During a storm, the Vikings didn't just look to the sky. They also looked inward. Because for them, nature was not silent. It spoke. The wind howled, lightning expressed anger, the waves grew impatient. But sometimes, this fury of nature was not just a physical event, it was a way for the gods to speak. Thor, in particular, as the Lord of the Sky, was remembered with each clap of thunder, as if delivering a message. But sometimes these messages were incomprehensible, and sometimes they didn't come at all. Those were the most difficult moments for the Vikings. The times when the gods fell silent, vanished. What was the meaning of those moments? During a storm, many Vikings would turn their faces to the sky. Captains would squint, trying to read the shape of the clouds as they attempted to change the wind's direction. Because they saw the darkening in the sky not just as the start of rain, but as the beginning of a divine warning. If the wind grew fierce, the waves rose, but no lightning fell, it could mean that Thor had fallen silent. Silence was sometimes heavier than shouting. Because for the Vikings, when the gods did not speak, a person had to turn to their own inner self. The silence of the gods was seen as a kind of test. Illnesses, failures, ships that had lost their way. Among these, each was sometimes a divine sign. Sometimes it was the silent form of punishment. Priests or old wise women would read the runes, interpret dreams, and try to discern the meanings in nature. But there were days when no sign could be found. Then, everyone would turn inward. Perhaps an oath had been forgotten. A tradition broken, a land unjustly taken. In moments when the gods were silent, people confronted their own voices. Silence bred not only fear but also responsibility. Because a silent god left you to deal with your own conscience. A Viking in this secrecy would ponder what was wrong. He would repent for the future, prepare small offerings. He would bury a piece of jewelry, set aside a piece of fish for the sea. These were not grand gestures, but small, deeply sincere acts. Because the Vikings perceived their gods not only as powerful beings but also as fragile entities who could be broken, offended, or sulk. When the storm subsided, if the losses were few, it was interpreted as the gods speaking again. But if the silence continued after the storm, it meant the message had not yet been understood. As the silence lengthened, unease grew. In the continuation of nature's silence, a person's inner voice began to be heard more clearly, and this voice was often filled with guilt, regret, and uncertainty. The silence of the gods was a deep metaphor in Viking society. It was a foundational feeling related not only to nature but also to fate. Sometimes, despite a victory in battle, this silence would continue. Because victory wasn't always a sign that one was on the right path. Sometimes, after a disaster, a small sign would come. A shift in the wind, a bird flying by, a stone dislodging from its place, and this would break the silence. In those moments, the Vikings would take a deep breath again, straighten their backs, and believe that life went on. The silence was walking, but it was also teaching. Because when the gods were silent, the Vikings began to be reflected upon, and sometimes a storm raged most fiercely inside them. When the sky cleared, not only the sun but also understandings were reborn. Therefore, for the Vikings, even when the gods were silent, they were still speaking, and this speech could be more real than the sound of thunder. Death and Valhalla. For the Vikings, death was not the end. It was a door. But where this door opened was determined by how one lived, how they fought, how they died. For them, the highest place was the hall of their chief god, Odin. Valhalla. It was a place where only those who died bravely could go, filled with warriors, where great feasts were held, and an eternal preparation was made. Because when the day of Ragnarok came, the souls feasting in Valhalla would take their place in Odin's army. And that is why, for a Viking warrior, not fearing death was not just a matter of courage, but a belief, even a secret. A warrior who showed fear could bring shame not only upon himself but also upon his lineage. Someone who fled the battlefield might survive, but their name would be forgotten. Whereas someone who did not let go of their sword until the very end would be remembered with honor, even when they fell. The path to Valhalla opened with this honor. For some, this dream was an immensely important part of life. Their every fight was seen as a test. Am I worthy of today's conditions? This question was asked in their demeanor, and the answer was given through their actions. The dream of Valhalla did not belong only to warriors. Women also carried this belief when sending off their husbands and sons. Die with honor, do not fear, they would say. Because they believed they would be reunited in Valhalla. This belief made separation more bearable, made grief seem like a birth. It was not weeping, but remembering with pride that was more important. Because fear consumed only the living, not the dead. On some nights, young warriors would look at the sky and watch the northern lights. Some believed these lights were the reflections of the souls fighting in Valhalla. The swirling, undulating, silent dance of green and purple lights seemed to lift the curtain to another world. Will there be a place for me there? One would ask inwardly. But the answer to this question lay not in the future, but in how they lived in the present. The fear of death was the most natural human emotion. But for the Vikings, there was no place for this fear. Because a fearful person's sword would tremble. A trembling sword created an opening. One who created an opening would fall. Therefore, courage was a mandatory armor. Every morning upon waking, the day was lived as if it could be the last. And if that day came, one must go to meet it with head held high, without turning away. Valhalla was a place not only for the strong but also for those who had faith. The dream of Valhalla also reminded them of the transience of this world. For a Viking, the most valuable thing was to leave behind an honorable name. Therefore, they feared being forgotten in life more than they feared death. Those who were not remembered, not those who couldn't go to Valhalla, were considered lost. To live on in stories, to be remembered in songs, to be carried in a child's name. That was the true structure of immortality, and Valhalla was the realm of those who deserved it. A Viking kneeling by the fire at night was, in fact, whispering not for death, but for a deserved place. Let them not forget me. Let my heart not falter. Let my sword not weaken. This wish was valid not only for the moment of battle but for every day. Because the path to Valhalla was paved not only by the final blow but by the sum of all his days. Rituals, prophecy, and belief. In the Viking world, the unseen was as real as the seen. They believed that behind the visible world lay another reality of nature and gods. Therefore, daily life was surrounded not only by work and wars but also by rituals, prophecies, and sometimes dark beliefs. Because for the Vikings, fate was not just a predetermined script, it was a riddle to be understood. And this riddle was sometimes hidden in a dream, sometimes in the blood of a sacrifice, and sometimes in the circles ravens made in the sky. Rituals were present at every stage of society. A newborn child was introduced to the gods with a water ceremony. The first haircut was a sign of growing up. During harvest times, offerings were made to the earth goddess Freya. Before a ship set sail, prayers were offered to Odin. During sacrifices, the animal's blood was poured onto certain stones. Prayers followed a specific order and wording. Because the correct ritual distinguished cultural identity. A wrong step could herald disaster. Therefore, meticulousness in rituals was the result not of fear, but of respect. Prophecies were the compass of the community. The ability of female seers, known as vulvas, to see the future was considered sacred. They saw not with their eyes but with their souls. During special ceremonies held under the moon, they would enter a trance amidst rising smoke and interpret the whispers of the gods. Before an expedition, before a marriage, or just before a child was born, people would listen to their words. And the more ambiguous the prophecy, the more deeply it was accepted. But prophecy did not always bring peace. Some foretold death. Sometimes a raven with black feathers appearing in a dream would herald an approaching war. Sometimes a woman seeing a burning ship rising to the sky in her night's sleep would be interpreted as a funeral procession. These images were inescapable. Because the Vikings believed that if fate was unavoidable, facing it was the nobler path. Prophecies did not frighten them, they prepared them. Dark beliefs also belonged to this world. Magic, curses, and old gods of death were part of daily life. In some houses, small corners were reserved for unseen beings. A piece of food, a drop of drink would be left there. Sometimes this was dedicated not directly to a god, but to the Huldra folk, hidden people, to secure their goodwill, to protect from illness. Because one did not conflict with the unseen, one made peace with it. Not all magic was for good. Black magic was feared. Amulets made with runic symbols could both protect a person and bring harm if misused. The lines carved on a stone were chosen carefully. Writing someone's name incorrectly could lead them to ruin or loss. This knowledge belonged only to special individuals, and these individuals were met with both respect and distance. This dark knowledge was considered more potent at night. The stories whispered around the fire often revolved around a curse, a forgotten god, or an abandoned temple. Children listened to these stories as if growing up with them. The adults would nod their heads. They believed what was told was not a rumor but a reminder. Because in the Viking world, the truth was sometimes in the things that remained silent. All these rituals, prophecies, and beliefs formed the unseen fabric of Viking life. For them, life was lived not only with strength but also with intuition. And this intuition was hidden in the direction of the wind, in the behavior of an animal, in the faint whispers of night dreams. Therefore, a Viking would carry a bundle of herbs in his pocket even while bearing a sword, would not forget to pray even while sailing to war. Because it was not possible to confront the visible without making peace with the invisible. Healing and shamanism. For the Vikings, a wound was not just a physical test but also a test of the soul. In the world of that time, there were no hospitals, doctors, or familiar medicines. But there was nature. Quietly flowing rivers, cool forests, roots identified with pain, and healing plants. The Vikings looked to the hands of those who knew how to speak the language of nature. Because a wound did not just bleed. Sometimes it would fester, become inflamed. Sometimes it would deepen over time. That was when the ordinary components of healing were insufficient. At that point, women known among the people as Sirkona or shamans, and knowledgeable men, would step in. These healers were seen as people who could talk to nature. They believed every stone carried, every plant housed, every animal bore a meaning. For a wound to heal, mere treatment was not enough. The cause of the wound also had to be understood. Because according to Viking belief, some illnesses could stem not just from bad food or cold, but from the displeasure of the gods, the unrest of ancestors, or an imbalance of the soul. For treatment, plants saved from the forest, animal fats, and special mixtures were often prepared. Medicinal plants like thyme, mint, wormwood, or bearberry were each used for a different ailment. Some were boiled, others applied directly to the wound. Healers paid attention not only to the season but also to the phase of the moon, the direction of birds, the origin of the wind. Because for the Vikings, nature was not just a resource but a guide bearing signs. But some ailments were beyond the power of plants. Especially for unexplained, long-lasting, recurring illnesses, shamanic rituals would come into play. Healer women would set up areas surrounded by special stones, burn incense, pray in ancient tongues, and circle the patient's head. Sometimes they would prostrate themselves, sometimes look to the sky. This was not just treatment. It was a kind of negotiation, a reconciliation ceremony. Spirits were called, gods were spoken to, and forgiveness was asked from ancestral spirits. Because some ailments were not just physical but the manifestation of a spiritual corruption. For children with persistent fevers, songs sung throughout the night were expected to heal. For an adult talking in their sleep, a bone fragment or runic symbol secretly placed under their pillow. These were not just practices, they were belief. Faith was half of healing, and this people did not underestimate the power of folk belief. Because the Vikings knew that sometimes a whispered solution could be as effective as a salve. Of course, not every treatment was successful. Some ailments resisted. When death approached, rather than treatment, preparation was made. Figurines symbolizing the gods were placed by the head of the dying person to ease the soul's journey. Sometimes a small fire was lit, sometimes instead of praying, they were simply held by the hand. In those moments, remaining silent was considered the deepest form of healing, rather than speaking. While shamanic treatments may seem far from science, in the Viking world, they were a system, a balance. Everything was in harmony with the nature of things. Healing was not just about regaining strength, it was about re-establishing harmony with nature, the gods, and the past. Therefore, the Vikings survived not only because they were strong, but because they knew how to listen to nature, to time, and to silence. A day in the life, from dawn to dusk. A Viking's day turned as the first sparks of morning gave way to night, and as night slowly receded, the pale light appearing on the eastern horizon became the herald of a new day. The wind, sifting through the northern forests, roamed the village roofs, nudging the remnants of sleep from the straw-covered roofs one by one. The roosters had not yet crowed, but you could understand from the faint hum between the wooden houses carried on the wind, morning was awaited. In a small Viking village, the morning did not find its place by being awakened. Time flowed here in its own rhythm. Eyes opened. Bodies sought refuge under the blankets a little longer to preserve the heat from the night. But the outside world did not preserve its patience for long. There was wood to be chopped, animals to be fed, fires to be prepared. The day did not wait. One of the first to wake was the old woman, Gunhild. She was a little more hunched over with the burden of back pain, but her hands were still strong. She got up from her bed to check the fire. She stirred the embers that had not gone out overnight in the hearth. She threw a few dry twigs on them. As the temperature rose, the house began to fill with the day's first breath. Everything was silent. It was a pregnant silence. Because soon it would be replaced by footsteps, children's laughter, the bleating of sheep, and the barking of dogs. Meanwhile, Eric, a boy who had just turned 12, one of the younger ones in the house, was squinting at the sun, watching the world outside. Today was not an ordinary day for him. For the first time, he would go to the field with his father, stand behind the plow, and learn how to turn the soil. It was one of the small but meaningful steps out of childhood. He was excited, but he tried not to show it. Viking children matured early. The seriousness at the corners of their eyes was the silent sign of this. Next to their house, Thornstein, Eric's father, was already chopping wood with his axe in the first minutes of the morning. The sound of the blow hung in the air. The freshly cut wood spread a warm scent against the cold morning air. For Thornstein, the morning was not just about the work to be done. He saw it as a kind of purification time. The mistakes of yesterday were corrected today, and if a wrong word had been spoken, it was silenced, lost within nature. At the other end of the village, the old Volva, who was kneeling for her morning prayer, saw the day with different eyes. Her eyes were what people called blind, but she could feel the emerging rays on her skin. She raised her hands to the sky and whispered to the gods, one by one. It was a familiar sight for everyone in the village. No one started work properly until her prayer was finished. Because a day being fruitful was related not only to physical effort but also to the prepared presence of the soul. As the Volva's prayer ended, the wind shifted direction. For her, this was a sign of good things. Today was a lucky day. Slowly, smoke began to rise from the other houses. Mothers woke their children. Faces were washed with cold water from the stream. In some houses, oatmeal was boiling. In others, they were preparing to get by with leftover bread slices. Viking tables were simple but warm. Sharing came before flavor. Younger siblings sat next to their elders and waited for them to be satisfied first. It was an unspoken rule in the house. Respect began at the table. In the village square, young men were tending to the horses. Women were checking the knots of their nets. The elders were warming their hands on the grass. Everyone had a task. The size of the task didn't matter, because the chain of life here was the same. One weak link strained the whole system. Therefore, even if you were a child, there was always a small chore to be done in the morning. No one started the day idle. As the shadows began to lengthen, preparations for the second half of the day began. This time, the work became a little harder. The heat increased, fatigue was felt, but still, no step was taken back. The plow was taken up again in the field, more wood was brought from the forest. Dried fish were gathered and hung on lines. The children had a bit more freedom during these hours. But freedom did not mean play. They too helped their mothers, carried water, kept the fires alive, watched and learned from the larger tasks. For the Vikings, knowledge began with observation. One didn't ask questions, one observed. In the afternoon, the village elders would gather for a small meeting. If a big decision was to be made or work assignments needed to be discussed again, this time slot was preferred. They would sit around the large stone in the square, cross-legged, and everyone would speak in turn. This was not a debate. It was a sharing of collective wisdom. Everyone listened. They remained silent until the person speaking finished. The young did not participate in these meetings but watched from a distance, because it was known that one day they too would sit there. In the middle hours of the day, the animals were checked, the nets were inspected, the water channels were cleared. For the Vikings, animals were not just food, they were part of a shared life. The cow's eyes were looked into, the sheep's wool was felt by hand, the dog's fur was brushed. A silent language was established with the animals. They didn't shout or get angry, because loyalty was built with respect, not force. Thornstein's dog, Skell, always walked one step behind him. It was as if he knew when to stop, when to move. As the day slowly leaned towards the west, everyone made their final preparations for the evening. But it hadn't arrived yet. The air was still warm, the shadows were still short. But inwardly, everyone was leaning forward. Because the Vikings measured time not by the sun but by the language of the shadows, and that language was now slowly whispering that the day was coming to an end. Evening and the hearth. As the sun's rays tilted towards the west, the light over the village took on a golden hue. The shadow of every object lengthened, the footprints on the soil turned into lines. Eric felt the fatigue settling deep in his bones. His arms were heavy, his knees stiff. But this fatigue was not burdensome, it was a fulfilling, peaceful tiredness. He had worked the soil all day, carried water, watched the animals, listened to the quiet conversations of people. He was now part of this cycle. His small hands were entering a great life. By the lake, the fishermen were making their final preparations. The nets had been in the water all night. Even though fingers grew numb pulling the heavy nets from the cold morning water, the work had to be done. Because the fish on the evening table were possible thanks to this silent effort of the morning. The old fisherman Raff, as he did every morning, looked at the water and whispered this morning too. "Give us enough. We do not ask for more." This was his prayer. It was neither written nor loud. But for years the water had heard him. As the day rose a little higher, the morning stillness began to give way to a tempo. Those going to the field set off. Breaking the hard crust of the earth with the tip of a plow was a tough job. But that soil had waited under the snow all winter. Now it was slowly ready to awaken. When Eric held the plow for the first time next to his family, his hands trembled. Thornstein didn't even watch him. He just whispered one thing. "The earth does not fight you. It only wants to know you." As the sun rose higher, the sky's energy turned from pale orange to bright white. The morning coolness had given way to a slight warmth. The Viking village was now fully awake. Everyone had dispersed to their tasks. The soil was pierced by the plow. The nets were pulled from the water. The children started carrying water and stacking wood. A silent tempo was present in everything. There was no shouting, no rushing. But everything progressed in a certain order. Just like Eric himself now. His hands now held the plow more firmly. The shaky touches of the morning had given way to controlled strength. His father, Thornstein, glanced at him from time to time but said nothing. Because this silence was a sign of trust. Words were not needed for this lesson. In the village square, the women had finished their morning chores and started preparing for the midday meal. This often consisted of meat from an animal hunted the previous day or fish from the morning's catch. Meat boiled in large pots was served with dry bread. Everyone received their portion. First the elders, then the children, and finally the young men. This order was not just out of respect, but to preserve the order itself. After wiping his tears, Eric became a shadow again. His hands were still in the soil. He started without even wiping the mud smeared on his face. This fatigue gave him a strange peace. After the meal, everyone rested for a short while. This was a rare time period for a Viking. Sitting in a quiet shadow, pulling their knees to their stomachs and stretching their feet towards the warming sun, some closing their eyes with their heads against the stone. Some told an anecdote from their childhood to those next to them. But most often, this rest passed in silence. Because the bodies, tired from the morning's activity, were now trying to gather themselves again. Fires were lit in the village square. There was a hearth in front of every house, faces around every hearth. Flames rose, sparks scattered towards the sky. The night's cold had not yet set in, but everyone wanted to get close to the fire. Because Viking nights were lived around the fire. It was both a space for storytelling and a border of silence. Some warmed their hands, some watched. Slowly, the telling began. The language of the night was memory. Thornstein crouched silently by the hearth. A rabbit was slowly roasting in front of him. He glanced sideways at Eric sitting next to him. His face was smudged with soot, but his eyes were shining. He didn't ask, "How was your day?" He didn't need to. Because the tired yet accomplished look in the boy's eyes already held the answer. Words like, "I struggled, I succeeded," were there, but they were all silent. The Vikings often didn't speak, they lived. At another hearth, old Raffen was looking into the fire, slowly turning a piece of wood in his hand. He was listening to the young people crouched beside him. As always, Raffen began with an old story. He might have told it 100 times, but no one was bored. Because Viking stories did not age. A new layer was revealed each time they were told. His words warmed the night a little more. The story, beginning with, "Once, when the sea was frozen, we found a ship washed ashore," slowly unfolded like a picture everyone knew. The woman was nodding her children to sleep, giving the yarn a twist, turning small stone figures in her fingers. Some children were dozing off, others were dreaming while looking at the stars. The sky was clear. The northern lights had not yet appeared, but everyone knew they would. Because in this village, nights were never completely dark. Nature always found a light, and that light shone brightest at night. In the later hours of the night, the village Valva, the wise woman, sat in the middle of a small circle. Young women, a few children, and a few men gathered around her. They closed their eyes in silence. They each held a piece of herb in their palms. A light wind blew. The Valva began to whisper the names of the gods. The words were ancient. Even if their meaning was not known, their effect was felt. This was not a prayer. It was a reminder. It was a ceremony of connecting survival, togetherness, the past and the future. Then everyone fell silent for a while. Only the crackling of the fire was heard. Everyone had something inside, but no one could say it. Because these hours were for feeling, not for speaking. Eric leaned his head on his shoulder. His eyes were about to close. Behind his eyelids, everything he had seen during the day began to appear. The soil opened by the plow, his mother's hands, old Raff's voice, the dog's eyes, the fish in the net, and the first star in the sky. Another day had passed. Silently, but leaving deep marks. For the Vikings, the end of another day was not just something to be taken back. It was the settling of another layer of life. The day was spent with labor, the night with others, and to be able to start again in the morning, one first had to pass through this night. The fires began to die down. People withdrew to their houses. The embers in the hearths would last until morning. As Eric fell asleep, the last thing he heard was a woman softly humming a lullaby. He couldn't make out the words, but the melody was enough. Because every child in this village grew up with this melody, was eventually laid to rest under the sky to its tune.